Hello and welcome to the ACR webinar to help answer ABR IRDR certification questions. I'm Sean Farley, ACR Director of Public Affairs. Before the webinar starts, please note that all participant phone lines are muted. If you would like to ask questions, please type your questions in the questions section in the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. If you're experiencing technical or audio issues, please click on the Help section at the top of the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen and click on Support, and then click Go to Webinar Support. Handouts are available. These include today's slides, ABR FAQs, and an ABR letter to credentialers. These handouts may be found under the Handouts section in the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. Our webinar will be recorded, or is being recorded. ACR will provide a link to the recorded webinar to all registrants as soon as it is available. Today's moderator is Dr. Timothy Swan. Dr. Swan is a board-certified interventional radiologist, the speaker of the ACR Council, and a member of the ACR's Board of Chancellors. Dr. Swan.
Thank you, Sean. The IR community has been working with the ABR for several years to develop a new primary specialty certificate for interventional radiology. The announcement of the new IRDR certificate is the culmination of these efforts and is set to take effect October 15th of 2017. The ACR has heard many concerns about the conversion process of the VIR CAQ to the new IRDR certificate announced by the ABR 3 to 4 weeks ago. There have been many questions and much discussion on the Engage platform with parallel discussions on the SIR Connect tool. The ACR has arranged this webinar so that ABR leaders can directly address your questions, clarify issues or misconceptions that have arisen but have not yet been discussed, and address concerns of members of the ACR. I should note that the SIR conducted 2 webinars last week that have been archived and are available on its website. The ABR has produced a number of documents, including an FAQ, that are posted on the ABR website. The ACR has obtained permission to post these on its website as well for member convenience, and they are available in the download tab as part of this webinar. Our intention in this webinar is not to repeat the questions that were asked either in the FAQ or on prior webinars, but there might be some follow-up clarifications or remaining questions that ACR members have that we'd like the ABR to address. Our panel this afternoon includes ABR trustee Dr. John Kaufman, ABR staff including Executive Director Dr. Val Jackson, and Associate Executive Director for IR Dr. Ann Roberts. Dave Laskovitz, ABR's Director of Internal Relations, is also a participant in this panel. SIR's President Dr. Suresh Vendatham is joining us as well. The ACR representatives on this panel include myself and Council Vice Speaker Rich Dusak. Thank you all for participating, and thank you registrants for participating in this webinar as well. So to get things going, I'll now turn over this program to SIR's Dr. Vendatham for some comments. He'll be followed by Dr. Kaufman for a short formal presentation before we launch into a Q&A session. Dr. Vendatham.
Well, thanks very much. Hello and welcome to everyone. This is Suresh Vendatham. I'm the president of the SIR, the professional society representing over 7,000 members in interventional radiology. I want to thank you for joining this session and thank the ACR and the ABR for coming together to help us provide more information to interventional radiologists. Over the past few weeks, we at SIR have heard from many of you about concerns related to the conversion of your DR certificate and VIR CAQ certificate to the new primary certificate. And we're participating here so that ABR leaders can directly answer your questions and address your concerns. I want to restate some important key points before we start. First, I want everyone to know that we at SIR are very appreciative of the ABR's commitment to translating this new primary specialty initiative into a strong certification credential. The extensive work that the ABR leaders and staff have done on the mechanics, and also their incredible receptiveness, shown especially so in the last few weeks, to input from the IR community on this and other matters. There are a number of resources that have been created over the last several weeks to help practicing physicians understand the historical development of this, and in particular the participation of the various organizations and practicing interventional radiologists and diagnostic radiologists in general in the process of developing this pathway. I think that explains partly why the pathway has been designed the way it is, and is important information when people have time to take a look at it. From my perspective, I think that we absolutely should embrace this certification. It provides, it's really something we should take tremendous pride in, and provides a way for us to continue to improve patient care in the future, and to improve our practices in the future. We fully recognize, though, that we wouldn't expect you to go into this unquestioningly. I've asked a lot of questions recently on your behalf, and I'm glad that you're asking more of them. I will say that I have become absolutely satisfied, and I'm absolutely confident that there's really no downside to converting to the new primary certificate in interventional radiology and diagnostic radiology. I myself have a lifetime DR certificate, and I am a VIR CAQ holder, and I converted my own certificate myself about a week ago, and I'm very proud of having done so, and I encourage you all to do the same. So thank you very much for attending tonight's webinar. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Kaufman now.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim, and all of the ACR who facilitated this webinar, and thank you, Suresh, for your comments. And I will just try and be quick and go through a slide set, which is hopefully be informational. This is going to be archived and available to you, along with the IR/DR FAQs, a memo to credentialers. These will be on the ACR website, and on the SIR website there's additional information, a timeline which outlines the progress of this, and also a copy of a letter that each VIR CAQ subspecialty certificate holder should have received from Dr. Jackson, outlining the sort of the sanctity of their lifetime DR certificate if they hold one of those. But I'd like to go ahead and proceed and with this brief update, so we can go to the next slide. So just there are three IR trustees. I'm representing the IR trustees on this call, and the ABR staff are Dr. Jackson Roberts and David Lazakovitz, who you heard about earlier. Go to the next slide. And just very briefly to kind of give you, and we can go on to the next slide. This is just the agenda, and I will really try and keep this very short so we can focus on questions. So it just gives you information on where you can find the written information that we had talked about, and I would encourage you, if you have any sort of questions or concerns remaining after this webinar, to reach out directly to the ABR. The information and contact information is there, and certainly I'd be happy always to sort of field any questions directly. You can feel free to reach out to me, and if you can get my contact information through the SIR website. Next slide. So this is just to give a framework or a context of this discussion, just a very brief review of how medicine is organized in the United States. There's a difference between the certification body and training body of the ABMS, which oversees all of the certification boards, the majority of the boards, and this is really defines sort of competency and testing for competency for individual physicians. The training is really under the responsibility of the ACGME, which trains in order to create people who are then able to be certified, and the ACGME works with the teaching institutions to make this happen. We can go to the next slide. So the progress for our becoming a new specialty really started in 2005, but culminated with recognition of IR as a specialty, and recognition of the IR/DR certificate as the embodiment of that credentialing for that specialty in 2012 by the ABMS. It took another 2 years of work by the ACGME to create sort of the training programs for this. The ABR had been working throughout this time on the mechanics and details of not only the transition, but the new testing that will be required for a new certificate. And now we are at the point of implementation. We go to the next slide. Just very historically, the only real reason for you to see this slide is to assure you that we had representation from both academics and private practice on the initial SIR Primary Certificate Task Force. This is the group that was commissioned by the SIR to begin this process. Again, Vicky Mark's timeline is excellent and has all this sort of information in more detail. We can go to the next slide. And many members of SIR ABR leadership have been involved in this process over time. Go to the next slide. And it's really essential for everyone to understand that although this began as an SIR sort of initiative, it's really a partnership with ABR, who's the staff you see represented here, that actually made this a reality. And a very important principle behind the IR-DR certificate is that the SIR never had any intention of seeking IR as a specialty in any other way except underneath the ABR. So it's really been a tremendous amount of support on the part of ABR for our specialty to actually make this happen right from the beginning, really from the outset. And we've been working side by side for 10 years to make this happen. Go to the next slide, please. So this is really just to sort of give me a moment to say that what has happened with this certificate is recognition of the three core competencies of IR, and with really a focus on the non-procedural patient care competency as making IR distinct, but also understanding that imaging competency is an essential part of this specialty. Their specialties are made up of unique combinations of skill sets, and there's really, if one of those skill sets is embodied by another specialty, that's really not any kind of issue, as long as all of the components together are unique in medicine, and we really have a very sort of clear message to the rest of medicine that our imaging competency, procedural competency, and patient care competency is very unique, and the recognition by ABMS of this is really a reverse mandate, in that all of the other boards in medicine recognize that this is the best way for interventional radiology to proceed in terms of patient care, is to have this structure and this recognition. If we go to the next slide. So I really just want to give you a sense of how this came about very briefly. As I mentioned, it started in 2005, the partnership with ABR 2006. There was extensive vetting of the concept, which ultimately resulted in an interventional radiology and diagnostic radiology certificate, a combined certificate with two competencies. A IR-only certificate was really viewed as non-viable by all of the stakeholders. No stakeholders included ACR. And at the 2011 AMCLC, this concept and this proposal was discussed and debated in the large assembly, and the support from ACR was garnered at that time. And I can tell you from our feeling at the time is that without ACR support, this was actually not going to be able to go forward. So it was a hugely important event for us at that particular meeting. And then, as you can see, we then went on to gain approval at the ABMS. So why is IR-DR so advantageous? Why do we end up with this particular thing? Just a moment on that. There's just incredible flexibility with this particular certification. This is really kind of unique in medicine, and I think a huge advantage for us that you have two competencies in one certificate. And as you'll see, your ability to maintain that certificate is greatly simplified through the way the ABR has organized this, and it allows many of the I would say majority of SIR members who practice some IR and some DR to continue to do that. And I'm sure that's true of many of the people on this ACR call, and a big part of the concern. And the certificate is very specifically interventional radiology and diagnostic radiology. And the board has multiple communications available to you and your credentialing organizations as to the equivalence of the diagnostic radiology component of that certificate with the straight diagnostic certificate. Next slide, please. And just there has been a big change in the ABR governance as well, requiring with the ABR now having separate IR trustees and an executive director for IR. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're going. So the initial IR/DR certificates will be issued by examination on October 15th. This is sort of the timeline that established the need for conversion of existing VIR subspecialty certificates, and sometimes called CAQ, but it is actually subspecialty certificate for conversion of those as well, because no boards are allowed to have 2 levels of certification for the same competency. So this is at that time, the VIR subspecialty certificate becomes a legacy certificate and is not something that can be maintained. The new certificate, as all new certificates from the board since 2012, is a continuous certificate. The IR portion can be dropped at any time. It's very simple, but the DR portion remains the foundation, so to speak, that you cannot drop. And all DR subspecialties are still available to IR/DR certificate holders. So those with pediatrics, neurology, nuclear medicine, subspecialty certificates, the IR/DR certificate serves as a parent certificate for those certificates. Next slide. So initially, a lot of questions and concerns about this transition. The SIR, and in a letter authored by Suresh, embodied many of these, and very briefly, these were the numerous the issues over DR certificate holders who have lifetime certificates, the concerns about the fate of their certificate or doubts about the ability to get them reactivated, the reporting concerns, the short timeline for making this decision or notifying the board, the concerns about having taken recent CAQ exams and how this then dovetailed with a new certificate and whether or not there would be unusual fees or additional fees for this. And then very legitimate concerns about how a new certificate appears to credentialing, privileging, and other regulatory bodies when there's a transition process, and what would happen to the old certificate. So I'm going to try and quickly get through these. We go to the next slide. So for those who have lifetime certificate, DR certificates, you will never lose that certificate. There is a letter to you from Dr. Jackson, and if you have not received that letter, contact the board and you will get another copy of it. I think it's been sent out perhaps twice now, basically confirming on ABR letterhead with her signature that you will always have the ability to reactivate your lifetime DR certification at any time for any reason that you decide to do that. And it will be the same DR lifetime certificate that you have now. This is something that, for those that are concerned about the board changing its mind, so to speak, just keep in mind that the board has changed the length of certification twice already, first to 10 years and then continuous, but the lifetimes were never changed. The board has a very solid record of maintaining the lifetime DR certification for those that have it, and so you can count on that being the same going forward. Next slide. Reporting is really, I think, a critical question. The only thing that will be on the ABR website is your current certification. For those, therefore, if you convert, this is what it would look like. So as you can see, any prior certificates, DR or IR, will not appear. You will not have anything reported as lapsed, as inactive. All they'll see for IR and DR is this certification. If you have a PEDS, neuro, or nuclear medicine subspecialty, that will be reported, and we report it according to the status of how you've been maintaining it. That won't change. So just again to reiterate, there will be nothing on the website that talks about what you had before. As you can see here, there's nothing here that indicates how long you've had a particular certificate. There's only the valid through date and what your maintenance status is. Next slide. The timing is a big sort of issue and concern, and understandably so. And the best I think I can do is just give you the information is that the conversion really has to happen on the 15th when the new examination takes place. Initially, the communication asked you by September 22nd to make a choice. This has been extended because of such the short timeline and to allow people to think more about this, recognizing that this is a monumental decision for all of us, and more time is necessary. But the October 15th really is a hard conversion date. There's just no way for the ABR to continue to have two different level certificates for the same competency. Now we can go to the next slide. So many of the discussions about this have been about the MOC, and I'll have some additional slides at the end on MOC. I think that the simplest way to think about this is that there's no difference in the requirements or the fee structure for maintaining your IR-DR certificate as there are for maintaining your VIR subspecialty certificate. All those of us with lifetime DR certificates have been maintaining our VIR certificate, and that has then by maintain the DR portion for us, and those for the continuous or 10 years, the same is true, and this will not change. There's a new MOC process that I will talk about a little, but that was happening anyways. That had nothing to do with this IR-DR certificate change, the online longitudinal assessment. That is just kind of happening anyway. So this conversion really has no impact and has not influenced anything related to MOC. And just you can see that last bullet point, all of the OLA content will be in interventional radiology, but we'll maintain both sides of the certificate. The next slide. The board is working very hard to minimize and eliminate any confusion about this change in certification that might impact credentialing, privileging. For example, a letter has gone out to all the state medical boards explaining this. That's already out in the mail. There are resources that you can download that clarify what the certificate is and what this conversion process means and the equivalence of this certificate to your prior competencies. And the board will be very happy to work with you at any time should you run into any issues regarding this. We recognize how really critically important this is. Next slide. So just some of the conversion details, again, not to sort of reiterate this too much, but there can't be really two certificates, two levels of certificate for VIR and IR. So the conversion really has to happen, but again, there is really no risk to those that choose to convert. By doing this, you end up with one certificate that clearly delineates both of these competencies. If you have a time-limited VIR certificate and you decide not to convert, it'll remain valid, but you cannot maintain it. So it'll be listed as valid on the website, but it is not something that the board will be maintaining. So the MOC maintenance part will be listed as being not maintained. And if you have a continuous VIR certificate that's not converted, it'll be reported as inactive. Next slide. So there's nothing that will be listed. Your DR certificate will never be listed as inactive, and particularly if you have a lifetime certificate, it'll be held in the background. You can reactivate it at any time for any reason. The IR portion is dropped. It is automatically reactivated, or if you want to, you can ask to have this reactivated. A time-limited DR certificates will remain effective through the valid through date on the certificate. If you drop the IR portion of the IR-DR certificate, there's a relatively small number of people with these time-limited DR certificates, but if you convert and then drop back, the certificate you get back would be effective and the valid through. Next slide. So I'm going to go quickly through maintenance of certification. Next slide. So it's important to just understand that everybody who are participating in MOC has to follow the continuous certification requirements at this time. The evaluation is completed annually. The major MOC requirements are unchanged with the IR-DR certificate. Again, the IR certificate really has nothing to do with any sort of changes in MOC. There's no changes in fees. And we have all been doing this with our VIR certificates, with as you see here, the last time-limited certificate issued being 2012. In order to have ongoing validity, you have to meet the MOC requirements, which is pretty standard. And if you go to the next slide, we'll quickly go through the MOC requirements as they exist. So the professionalism and standing, that's your state license. CME is pretty standard for most of us, just even for our local credentialing. There is an SA-CME component. The online longitudinal assessment is replacing the traditional exam, and I'll give you some details about how that process will go. And again, that has nothing specific to do with IR-DR, but we just have a specific approach to that for IR-DR. There's been, I think, really a great sort of advance in how we do our improvement in medical practice component. It's either PQI project or any activity that leads to quality improvement that you should probably already be doing anyway, such as M&M's regular participation and M&M conferences. So that part has been made very easy, and the fee change is unchanged. The fee structure is unchanged. If we go to the next slide. So there have been a number of improvements. The ABR recognizes the challenges. Many of us on the ABR, most of us are practicing interventionalists and physicians, so we feel the same pain everyone else feels, and we are trying very hard to sort of make this a process that's sort of more seamless with day-to-day practice. So the activities that can be SA-CMEs have been expanded, better ways to track your MOC, the sort of what I think is great sort of advancement in what we consider PQI participatory activities, the ABR Connections Customer Service Center, which has really been working beautifully. The online attestation for MOC, so you just attest that you're doing this without having to upload extensive amounts of data. There's a new website, and the online longitudinal assessment, which will be launched in 2019. And I have one more slide to that, and then we'll be able to go to questions. If we go to the last slide. So again, this is the point of this webinar is really to talk about the IR-DR conversion and the concerns about that. Many MOC questions have been wrapped up in that, so we wanted to address that, but this was really, the point of the webinar was really not to focus on this, but I thought it'd be useful to have this information. The online longitudinal assessment will be sort of a rolling assessment. There will be questions that will be emailed to you. You'll have a number of opportunities, 104 to answer them, but you will have to attempt 52 per year. All of our content will be IR. There will be no DR content. The same way that currently with MOC, we maintain our DR certificate by maintaining our BRR subspecialty certificate. This is not any kind of a change. You'll be able to decline a certain number of items per year, and you can sort of batch these so that you can wait to the end of the month and answer all the questions. And there will be no summative assessment until 200 items are answered. So we're actually a couple of years out before there's going to be any kind of assessment of meeting MOC. So that process is all sort of in development as we speak. So that's the last slide for this presentation. And again, there are many of us on the board. We appreciate the ability to be here and answer the questions that you now have, and we can turn this over now for questions.
Thanks, John.
So
go ahead, Val.
This is Val Jackson, and I just wanted to echo or assure everyone of ABR's support of this. I think it has been a very good collaborative effort, and we've been working very diligently to get this rolled out. I know that a lot of people feel that they've never heard of this before, but I know everyone has information overload. We've tried to get this out in a number of different venues at meetings and with emails, but again, we completely understand that some people have not been aware of this before, but that's why we're really trying to make sure that we get information out and get your questions asked. Should we not get to your question today, we've been, in these past 2 SIR webinars, we've been trying to contact the people who've asked questions to make sure that they get their question answered if it wasn't done so during the webinar itself. So it's really important that we make sure that you have the information that you need. So thank you, and go ahead, Tim.
All right, thanks, Val. As long as, John, you were talking about OLA, there's one question that came in, and basically it says, I currently do my MOC in 2 modules of IR and 1 in general radiology. This individual practices both IR and DR in daily practice. So is there an option for that individual, if he or she obtains an IR-DR certificate, to do MOC? You said 100% MOC and IR. Is it possible for that individual to maintain some competence in DR by incorporating that instead of one of the IR modules?
Yeah, maybe David, are you able to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I had to unmute everything, so it took a couple of clicks. So for somebody that has an IR-DR certificate, at this point, all of the content would be IR content. So there is some non-interpretive skills content that's a part of OLA, which is the case for everybody doing OLA, whether you're IR-DR or just straight diagnostic radiology. But there's not an option to further profile or exam content beyond IR.
And Tim, I would just add that certainly the CME can be, CME that's in DR, that would not be any kind of issue. And currently, the way that's a personal choice that individual has. And I think for the IR-DR certificate OLA, our thought was to really narrow it down to just the IR part, in the same way that many people use the VIR certificate to maintain their DR certificate. But that's a good question, and I think the board will stand behind the DR, sort of the representation of the diagnostic radiology part of the certificate as representing competency. There's absolutely no question of that. Your credentialing organizations don't know what you're doing your MOC and what modules you're taking. Only you do.
Another similar question, based on comments and discussions held separate from this webinar. Since IR and DR represent new primary certificate and will be promoted by holders as an IR primary certificate, does the ABR intend to promote the concept that diplomates who hold a DR certificate are equally qualified to practice IR as an IR-DR diplomat?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. This is the same sort of issue that we have always faced with a VIR subspecialty certificate, and was a significant point of controversy in 1991 when the VIR fellowship started with a move towards creating a subspecialty certificate. And it has never been the intention of ABR or SIR to prevent anyone from getting credentialed to do what they are capable of doing. The goal of the certificate is to embody and identify a cluster, a group of competencies that really identify someone as a specialist overall in interventional and diagnostic radiology. But in the same way that the VIR subspecialty certificate was not ever intended, and I don't think was ever really used to block individuals, credentialing is really a local question, and what the local boards decide is really something that is beyond the purview of the ABR, and we've certainly not intended to influence that at all.
So many diplomats don't believe that they should have to be the primary advocate with respect to credentialing bodies regarding the certification change. Rather, it should be the ABR's responsibility to communicate the change and the significance of it. What's the ABR proactively doing to assist its IR/DR diplomates and those diplomates who surrender their VIR CAQ with credentialing issues and associated education of health systems and third-party payers' credentialing bodies?
Well, this is Ann Roberts. I can say that, you know, if you look on the handouts that are on the side of the webinar control panel, you'll see 3 handouts. One is FAQs, one is memo to credentialers and credentialing bodies. And I think if you read that one, you'll see that there's an explanation of what the IR/DR certificate is, and the fact that it reflects full competency in both diagnostic radiology and interventional radiology. I think that we're in the process of sending that out to, you know, remember a lot of this credentialing goes through the ABMS and through their certifacs, and we've been working with them to make sure that there's no issues with that. I personally have talked to my credentialing people, the head of our credentialing section, and asked her if there was any problem with this, and she said absolutely not. There should be, all we do is to go on, and as long as you have a valid certificate, that's fine, and we're not going to be worrying about you know the fact that the CAQ doesn't show up anymore. So hopefully that will help people. And certainly if anybody has a problem or an issue, they just need to call the board, and we will work with them to make sure that this gets resolved.
So I want to add, this is Val, and I want to add one thing to Ann's discussion, which was totally right. And that is, I know that there are questions about when you go for certificate or for credentialing and you have to fill out your form every couple of years. The question about, have you ever had a certificate revoked or whatever for any reason? And we've had a lot of discussion about this, and you can truthfully answer no, because the certificate has been converted. You haven't surrendered it or had it revoked for a disciplinary reason, or for anything that would make it so that you would have to answer, yes, you've had that done. The correct answer, the truthful answer is no. We converted the certificates. We didn't take it away from you, per se.
All right, thanks. A couple of questions regarding the process of change, opting in, opting out, et cetera. Can you just briefly review that? I know it came out in the original letter, but can you just briefly summarize for folks what they should expect to be doing?
Well,
David.
This is Ann again. Basically, what they need to do is to go to the letter that they have and click on the link. They should have gotten the letter through an email. Click on the link, and that will allow them to opt in to the IR/DR certificate. You know, honestly, I would tell anybody, I think that that's the right thing to do. If you have a VIR certificate right now, a subspecialty certificate, you want to go to the IR/DR certificate. And there's really, I think people really need to hear that there isn't a downside to doing that. I mean, if down the line, you know, you decide that you don't want that certificate and you only want to practice DR, then you can go back to what you had in DR. But right now, the thing that you would want to do is to definitely go ahead and opt into this process. If you have any questions or any concerns, then what you would want to do is to call the board office, and there's a lot of people there that are more than happy to help you in terms of making you feel comfortable with what's going on.
All right, thanks. If an IR/DR diplomate chooses to surrender an IR portion of the certificate and return to a DR certificate in mid-MOC cycle, will the accumulated MOC activity also revert to make the DR certificate reported as being in compliance? Or will the diplomat have to complete DR-specific modules to be in compliance?
Well, at the time that they would make the conversion, they're in their MOC, they're doing whatever, they're doing their MOC that was needed for the IR portion of that certificate. When they would drop that portion of the certificate, then at that point, they're going to have a DR, and assuming that if they had a lifetime certificate, they're not required to do MOC. If they have a time-limited certificate, to keep that keep that valid, they would need to go ahead and be in MOC. But the certificate itself would be valid. They would just need to show that they're participating in MOC requirements. And then if they were if they had a continuous certificate, which most people will, sort of have by now, then that certificate, they'll go back into MOC, but their MOC, they'll then pick what it is. So if they decide, I don't know, they're going to do MAMO, or they're going to do MSK, or they're going to do whatever it is, then they would start doing their OLA in that area, so that they, because it would be appropriate to what they're doing at that point.
Yeah, Tim, just to reiterate, the MOC maintains both sides of the certificates, so in the IR. So I think that person's concern is if they decide to drop the IR, would they suddenly have a DR certificate that is not being maintained? That's not the case, because as we stated, there are two competencies in the certificate, and both are maintained by the MOC that's applied towards the IR side of it.
All right, thanks. Would you discuss just briefly the alternate pathways for DR diplomats who practice IR full-time or even part-time but do not have a VIR CAQ currently? How they can go about obtaining an IR-DR certificate?
Yeah, so there are, there are a couple of requirements, and I think this has clearly been an area that's of some concern, particularly to those individuals, and I think the board is taking note of that. Currently, if you're within 10 years of your fellowship, you are eligible to then examine at this point for the new certificate. So you do not have to have the VIR certificate in your pocket if you're within 10 years of your fellowship. If you never took that exam, but you still have that window of eligibility, you would just take the oral portion of the new IR-DR exam, just like anyone else would do. The really difficult portion is those that are more than 10 years out, that never had a certificate, or their certificate has lapsed. So essentially, they are completely outside that window. The existing pathways are if in an institution an academic institution where they're for 2 years practicing, they can potentially be eligible for the exam. They would have to meet MOC requirements, or for those that are really completely out, the other existing pathway is repeating the 1 year of fellowship. The board does understand that this is really a difficult question for those individuals that, for whatever reason, decided the certification was not important in the past and have now changed their thinking about that. But those are the existing pathways.
All right, and with the I was going to ask, does that same existing pathway, alternate pathway, apply to individuals who currently hold a CAQ and VIR, but who opt out for some reason, and then sometime after October 15th decide to opt in?
Yeah, I'll let David. Yeah, I don't know, David, if you want to answer that. So
sure.
Someone who has currently holds a VIR CAQ, but opts out of the conversion today, but sometime after October 15th says, oops, I made a mistake, I want the certificate. Are they just out of luck and have to use an alternate pathway?
No, because they've had the
Okay.
VIR certificate in the past, if they choose not to convert, but choose in the future and change their mind and decide that they would like the IRDR certificate, then they would re-enroll for IR, and then they would start participating in MOC. And if they needed an exam at that point in time, then they would take an exam. So again, if they've been greater than 10 years since they've taken an exam or passed an exam previously. So they're not out of luck if they don't convert now. If they had a VIR certificate, if they have a VIR certificate and decide not to convert, or if they've had a VIR certificate in the past and have let that lapse, you can still always re-enroll.
Okay. Series of questions, hopefully quick ones on CAQ status after 10/15/2017. So if a continuous VIR CAQ holder decides to opt out, the ABR has stated that CAQ will be reported publicly as inactive, not maintained. At one point in time, if ever, will the continuous CAQ cease to be publicly reported?
Well, it would cease to be reported when it no longer exists. So in other words, if you had a continuous VIR certificate at this point and you dropped it, then it would just disappear. I think that I'm pretty sure I've got that right. It wouldn't show up at all because it was a continuous certificate. It had been it's not being maintained. It's not valid anymore. So it would just, all you would see is a DR certificate for whatever that DR certificate is good for, lifetime, time limited or continuous. Okay.
So let me clarify a little bit. If you choose not to opt in and you have if you choose not to convert to an IRDR certificate, and you have a continuous VIR certificate right now, that VIR certificate would show as not maintained, and it would show with a status of invalid. I don't know the technical items behind how long it stays there. I can definitely follow up with our IT team to see how that goes, but I do not know the answer to that question. Now, the question that may come after this is, what if I choose to convert? What happens to my continuous certificate? In that case, absolutely, and this applies for both a continuous VIR and a time-limited VIR. If you choose to convert, the only certificate that will show is the IRDR certificate. The other certificates will not be displayed.
Okay. Sort of a follow-on, but kind of a little different twist to that question. So a time-limited VIR certificate holder converts to an IRDR certificate, but subsequently reclaims the DR certificate before the VIR certificate actually expires. I think the last ones are around 2021. Will the diplomat's VIR certificate be reported publicly when he converts back to the DR certificate? Or has that certificate vanished because they accepted the IRDR certificate?
It would vanish at that time. If they accept the IRDR certificate, it would just show as the IRDR certificate.
And it doesn't come back for public reporting, even though they convert back to the DR before their time-limited VIR certificate disappeared. Or expired, rather.
No, the CAQ, I don't think that this once you, let me make sure I've got the question right. The question is, if you convert to the IRDR certificate, and then you decide you don't want that and you want to go back just to doing DR, what would show up in terms of the CAQ certificate?
That's a basic question.
My understanding would be it would only show your DR certificate. It will not show anything about you having had a CAQ in the past, because you've already converted to the IRDR. So now when you convert back, you're just going to have a DR certificate.
Okay. There has been some angst about the not maintained and expired terminology being used for alternate reporting of those who maintain a CAQ after October 15th. Have you explored other alternative language like legacy certificate or no longer offered or converted to a new certificate, something on that order, just for public transparency?
Well, first of all, and I'll give a shot to this, and then maybe David wants to chime in on this. First of all, I think that you have to say, you know, that the fact is that we can't maintain it. So once you have that certificate, we can't take it away from you because it's time limited, assuming you have a time limited one. It's time limited, so we can't take it away from you. So we have to report the fact that you have it. But the problem is that you can't maintain it because we can't have two certificates, one that are both covering IR. That's been made very clear to us. That can't happen. So we have to somehow notate that it can't be maintained because those are the words, MOC. You know, you can't maintain it because it doesn't exist to maintain. We don't have a process to maintain it. And so it's basically, you know, it's there and it's valid, but it can't be maintained.
Okay.
I don't know if David has anything he wants to add to that or not.
No, I think that covers it.
We've got about 7 minutes left, so I'll try to get through a couple more questions here. ABR has indicated that those who hold a VIR certificate who choose to accept the IR-DR certificate may return to the DR certificate anytime in the future. Does the ABR intend that return to the DR certificate be done at no cost to the diplomat?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Jackson, and I can assure you that it will happen as soon as the person requests it. We will send them the new certificate. We are not going to charge them anything. And if they are not required by virtue of whatever their DR certificate was to be an MOC, they won't have any MOC fees.
All right.
Tim?
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's an important question here that I just saw about practice and how an individual practices, whether is there any minimum requirement for IR professional activity for the certificate? So there is not. Yeah, there's not. It's an interventional and diagnostic radiology certificate. The supporting it is through the MOC process. It is not. There was no practice part of it. So the intent being people can have very variable amounts of practice. Someone may be 10% IR, 90% DR, or 100% IR. This certificate will cover all of those people.
I'm just trying to briefly read through a couple of others of these questions. Do you see any others that you think we haven't answered or can directly address?
Yeah, you know, I think there's always a sort of a basic question is why are we even doing this? That's in there as well. And you know, again, I think the goal here was really to primarily move the training forward in a way that would emphasize the non-procedural patient care, and at the same time that created the ability to identify interventional radiology as one of the specialties under the ABR, and the then ability to combine the two certificates was just actually, I think, greatly to our advantage, somewhat unique, and something we ought to be kind of happy about, because it's in other specialties where these kinds of events happen, they have to maintain actually 2 separate certificates. So our ability to achieve that with the ABMS, I think, was a success. And to be honest, the drive to do that was from the people who are on this webinar, who are in practice doing both IR and DR, and made it very clear that the only way forward for this was this combined certificate, and that's what we took forward. So just to reiterate very briefly, because there's a question there about some of the underpinnings of this.
Yeah. There was some question earlier that just reminded me, this discussion just reminded me of it. And I'll just read it. I was at the 2011 AMCLC. The overwhelming voice of the council was that folks who like their old certificates could keep it. I think you addressed that, basically saying ABMS wouldn't let you do that, but is there anything else you want to?
Yeah, no, that person has great memory. That person has a very accurate memory. We really, the intent was never to jeopardize anyone who is currently in practice. In fact, at the time, that also, the endorsement also was if you wanted the new certificate, you would be able to examine into it. So although we lost the ability of maintaining 2 different certificates, which was not our choice, we have created a situation in which everyone converts. So there is no dual standard. There's no second class or potential sort of perception of a second class of certificate. So although we did lose that, we actually eliminated the requirement of having to examine into it if you want it. It's literally, you just say, I've earned this credential by having a diagnostic certificate and a VIR certificate. You have earned the IR/DR certificate, and it's yours if you want it.
Go ahead.
Tim,
go ahead.
Tim, this is Val, and there are a couple questions in here that I would like to address. Questions asking why the ABR trustees or task force members are all 100% interventional academic practice people. And I would just like to say that we really value volunteers who come from a diversity of practices, and we are actively courting people in private practice, but we have some difficulty getting them to have the time or be interested in being volunteers for us. So if anybody that's on this call would like to volunteer for the ABR, we would love to have you because your input is very valuable. So I just want to put in a plug. If you're interested in volunteering, you can contact me, or we have a volunteer spot on the ABR website that you can sign up for.
All right, thanks, Ann. If you have questions that haven't been answered, please contact the ABR office directly. Those questions that have been submitted as part of this webinar have been recorded. They will be put into the hands of the ABR, and hopefully they will be added to the FAQ that has already been created, or a new FAQ created to answer these questions directly. So thank you, panelists and participants. I remind you that this session will be archived and will be available on the ACR website for your review later. Materials associated with this webinar and a link will be emailed to all registered participants. Also remember that there is an FAQ and other documents available both on the ABR and ACR websites for your review and use. Thank you again for your participation. Have a good afternoon.